All right, guys, let's talk about back attacks, right? So I want to preface this by saying this is going to be a pretty rudimentary, basically to give you an understanding on a back attack system, but it's not going to be extensive, right? Obviously, back attacks alone could be anywhere from 8 to 12 hours just covering those positions. But because this instructional is entries to the front head, maintenance of the front head, returning them to the floor, front head strangles, go behinds, mat returns, all jiu-jitsu based. We're going to cover some basic attacks, and I want to give you an understanding of my back attack style of grappling, right? I'm mostly known for heel hooks, but I think at this stage, I've probably got equal finishes from the back as I do from heel hooks, right? So I want to give you an understanding of my methodology for that and the just the basics of it. And really the most important part of the back attack system is back control. And the most important concept of back control is diagonal control, right? And that relates to our control over one side of their body from the lower half in terms of hip control and that far leg control to the opposite shoulder underhook control, right? And how as long as we have a form of diagonal control, we should be able to maintain control over their back, right? So let's have a look at some examples of what would constitute diagonal control and what wouldn't. So let's look at it in the form of a seatbelt, right? So a seatbelt basically is a form of underhook. It's a form of underhook control. We have control under their arm here, an underhook, and the seatbelt also has control above their shoulder here. And the control above the shoulder really prevents them getting too high on us, whereas if we just had a regular body, rear body lock, and we were flat in our back, they could work their way up the body. But the underhook in this seatbelt position and the pressure on top of the shoulder keeps them sort of chest to back here. But that's not all we need to control. Again, we have to control some of the lower half. So if I were to take a seatbelt on this side, that would mean I'd have a left underhook control. And if I fell to the left side, the most important hook I need here to keep control over Placido is going to be my right hook. If he beat my bottom hook and he hopped over the top, you can see I still have pretty good control over Placido. He's on his way to escaping, but he can't turn to face me yet because of this underhook control and the combination of this lower body right side hook. So if you want to think of it loosely, if your left arm's under their underhook, your right hook has to be in. If we were to switch this up and I were to simply have same side underhook and same side bottom hook here, there's nothing stopping Placido turning away from me. So there's nothing about that control that prevents Placido turning away. So if we have same side underhook seatbelt and same side bottom hook, Placido can simply turn away from it. So what we need is top side hook in relation to the shoulder underhook we have here. And from this control, it's going to be difficult for Placido to turn away from me or turn into me. If, however, I had top side hook and top side seatbelt, I cannot keep Placido from getting his inside shoulder to the floor. So the better you understand this concept, the better you're going to be able to have maintenance over their body. The old sort of theory of back control is basically always get the bottom hook, right? So if I had Placido here, the old theory was basically just ensure you have the bottom hook. But that doesn't make sense within the scope of Placido's possible escapes, because if I don't have a top hook, he can again turn away from me. So the best way to think about it is the side we have a seatbelt on, you need the hook on the other side to have great control. Whether Placido turns to his right or his left, we're going to have excellent control over both, whether that be just one hook or we throw in both. And whether that be the top hook or it now becomes the bottom hook, we need to have that diagonal control here. So if Placido does beat a hook, we're in a great position to stay behind him. So I would say following the principles of diagonal control ensures that you remain behind your opponent. So the rule shouldn't be to automatically take the bottom hook. The rule should be, if we only have one hook, make sure it's the opposite to the underhook seatbelt style we have. All right, guys, we're going to be talking about rear naked strangles now. So let's talk about some common mistakes people make, right? For me, the first common mistake people make is they reach the strangle hand as deep as possible, but then they leave this elbow, their secondary elbow, behind their partner's shoulder. So if Placido lifts his shoulder here, or he can hand fight, it's going to make it pretty tough for me to get the finish here, right? So some key principles I want you to remember is that we're trying to reach elbow to elbow. So my elbows are starting to touch, and then both elbows drag across body here. Again, in terms of squeeze, I'm not squeezing as hard as I can because it would be crazy, because Placido, it might take Placido 3, 4, maybe even 5 seconds to tap. And really, if you even practice by yourself, you try to squeeze something as hard as you can for 5 seconds, you immediately start to fade. So we want to hit a squeezing pressure that we can maintain. And really the way we do that is by using position and technique to apply the strangle. Whereas if I just squeeze as hard as I can, again, my biceps are going to gas out, and Placido might be about to tap, and I relieve pressure, and he escapes. And that happens a lot. A lot of beginners try to squeeze submissions as hard as they can, and then the guy's about to tap. Sometimes you even see them lift their hand. The guy doing the strangling doesn't see them lift their hand, and then they gas out, and their hand goes back down, and they're back in the fight, right? So when we're practicing these strangles here, I want you to get this arm deep, get the strangle arm deep behind the shoulder. We're going to make sort of a hollow body to make space for this second hand. So keep space with your shoulders. Try to keep your head as close as possible, and that'll help you feed this second elbow deep. So we get that elbow deep, and it grabs the bicep here. And what we're looking to do is bring our elbows together here. So bringing the elbows together isn't using much energy at all from me. And then when we bring 2 elbows across, we start to get that strangle. And again, I'm not really squeezing hard at all. Obviously, I'm squeezing hard enough to keep things in position that if Placido pushes on it, he doesn't break it free, but I'm not squeezing so hard that it fatigues me. So again, if I just try to throw it here, Placido's going to push on this elbow. I'm never going to get this elbow to elbow connection. Whereas if we make a little bit of a hollow body, we throw that arm in, and I throw the elbow in front of Placido's shoulder. Now Placido starts trying to push on elbows here. Very, very difficult, as opposed to here, where he's got much more leverage to push on this elbow. If you push on this elbow, Placido, he's going to strip it. So again, elbow to elbow, elbows across. Another thing we need to do, another common mistake people make, and this is true, guys that are very, very tough. So even if we get everything perfect, instead of pushing on the elbow, Placido reaches for this hand. If he grabs this hand and pulls it back in front, now we're back to square one, and we're back to him defending. So when we throw this second hand into position, place your chin on top of it. Now Placido reaches back. Even if he grabs my fingers, my chin is in the way. If my chin's out, Placido pulls the hand free and strips it every time. So again, that's what I want you guys to emphasize here. So if I'm behind Placido here, we're reaching as deep as we can. We're making a pit stop behind the shoulder here. We hollow body, so my chest comes back, but my head stays forward. That gives us the space to throw this hand in such a way that the elbow gets deep. If I don't hollow body, we're back here, and Placido can push the elbow. So again, huge, huge detail. Seems minor, but very important at the highest level. Hollow body, throw it in, chin on top. Elbows together, elbows across. And we're gonna get that tap very, very easy with very minimal squeeze. Because again, you don't wanna just go full power on people and then run out of steam before you get the submission. Because not only have you lost the submission, you've lost your energy, and they have a good chance of escaping and then getting the win against you. All right, guys, let's talk about securing the strangle on the underhook side, right? Ordinarily, people would strangle find it easier to strangle on the strangle side. So when I say underhook side, we have a seatbelt and we're on this bottom side here, right? Because, I mean, obviously there's gonna be challenges in exposing the strangle, but once we get here on the underhook side, the strangle is freeing this arm, right? Because like I said, we need to get elbow to elbow. And even if I get this out, it's hard for me to get my hand in the back here. Whereas if we compare this to if I was on the strangle side and the underhook side, it's very easy once we get the strangle to hollow body and get our elbows together, right? So what a great trick we can do from here is I got to sit Placido up. And now we can manipulate his arm on this side in such a way that we can force him to sit up. Because if we were to sit him up, we would have the space to throw the non-strangle hand deep and go elbow to elbow. So when we get this across the face here, I grab the hand and I really target the wrist here. No thumb or thumb doesn't make a difference for this particular move. Whatever you find, you get superior control of with the knuckles. And what I do is I punch Placido's arm straight and I pull it behind his back and he sits up and he brings me to this upright position. And now, very easy for me to dive elbow to elbow and drag them both across here. So again, don't think of it as so much as you're using force to sit Placido up. You're manipulating his shoulder in such a way that he sits up, right? Because when I pull this behind his back, if he remains still, he's gonna have to submit. But he can move to get more room from this grip. So he's relieved it here and we sit him up. So that's what I want you to visualize with this movement. And of course, it's not going to be very easy to just slowly force this hand straight, slowly pull it back. The trick really is I move it back and forth a little bit and then I punch it out. Once it clears his shoulder line here, he's not going to be able to resist it well. If the hand's above the shoulder and I try to pull it and Placido resists, he's very strong. If his hand's behind his shoulder here and I pull it, he starts to sit up. And of course, that's when we can get a free shot at the neck here. So in my opinion, there is no superior side to hit a strangle on. There's just going to be some other obstacles in the way from the underhook side. And again, we can possibly get it from the underhook side, but that perfect elbow to elbow pressure and two elbows across is going to be limited if we cannot sit them up from the underhook side. All right, guys, so we've covered the strangle mechanics. We've covered the strangle from the strangle side. We've covered the strangle from the underhook side. But of course, sometimes we don't get a clean strangle under the chin. Sometimes we have to go over the chin. And that's where we have what's called a mandible strangle. So Placido is going to demonstrate how he would tuck his chin, right? So obviously, for those unfamiliar, I'm trying to get under the chin. But if he tucks it, it's hard for us to get what a lot of people would consider a clean choke. But in reality, we are choking the carotid arteries. And when he tucks his chin, he's not actually protecting against the carotid arteries, and we still find mechanics to finish that strangle. So whenever Placido's tucking his chin, I always go as deep as I can. I'm trying to get my elbow as deep as his center line here. So I'm not going to have my elbow here for a mandible strangle. I'm going to have it deep. What we're going to do is we're going to connect our hands exactly how he had. So remember how we were talking about elbow to elbow? We're going to do exactly that. Elbow to elbow again. But instead of thinking of pulling two elbows cross-body, I want to just bring both my elbows towards his pec. And then I apply downwards pressure to get that submission, right? So we can still strangle Placido through his chin as long as we have downwards pressure and slightly across to his pec. So when we have the chin out of the strangle, I'm going to be bringing elbows across to get the strangle. We have his chin in. We're still bringing him across from an elbow to elbow position, but we're just placing him on the pec. And I bring everything down, and we should be able to get a clean strangle. So obviously, I want to preface this with saying, Placido's chin's in the strangle, and we just squeeze as hard as we can. Yeah, it's going to hurt them. It is going to hurt. It's also going to strangle. Most people in a training environment will tap to the pain. Most people in a competition environment will eat a lot more of that pain. So again, if we want to strangle him, we want to use slow, consistent pressure. And we can strangle through the chin cleanly as long as we don't just go crazy on the squeeze. We apply steady pressure and pressure down, and we're going to find a clean strangle despite the mandible being in the way. So again, just because you see training partners in the gym strangling each other over the face, it's not fair to assume that it is a pain submission. We can still submit them and strangle them through that, and if we do it technically, it really is not going to hurt your opponent or training partner all that much. All right, guys, let's talk about the garrote and basically a variation of a strangle so that we could do it with one hand, right? So let's assume a position where this might come up, right? So perhaps we have trapped an arm, whether that's behind his back or whether we've crossed both feet in front, right? And again, here we have this battle. Some guys are very persistent, so every time I take this out, Placido controls this hand, and I can't get a secondary hand in the equation. And sometimes we can't even sit them up, like in the previous instruction of how to sit someone up from the underhook side, right? So when we want to hit a garrote, it's going to be different mechanics. I'm not trying to go elbow deep, and I'm not trying to basically strangle the carotids with my forearm and bicep. What it's going to actually be more entail is kind of like we're slitting someone's throat. Like I'm applying pressure, creating a wedge behind his shoulder with my fingers, and I'm pulling my elbow shallow, and I'm really trying to collapse the elbow into his throat here. So obviously it's going to be a very unpleasant style of strangle, but again, what other choice do we have if we can't get two hands into the strangle? So we come nice and deep, we secure a wedge behind the shoulder here, and we start to just pull our elbow back towards us as we push our head forward. We're going to get a strain. It's going to be quite unpleasant on the Adam's apple here. So again, we're coming under. We secure this wedge behind the shoulder here. So I'm really trying to get as close to wrist deep as possible. And instead of squeezing everything in and keeping my elbow in the center line, I pull my elbow off center and start to apply pressure back. And that's how we're going to get it. So let's look at it from the other side so that you guys can visualize it too. So this shot, we've created a wedge behind and we're pulling the elbow back, and that's how we're going to get the strangle. But don't forget to keep your head in play. If we pull our head back, Placido's head can move with me. He's got plenty of room here. So we're using our head to stuff his head into place. We've got the fingers as close to wrist deep, wedge behind the shoulder. And instead of keeping my elbow square and central, I pull my elbow back, and we can start to apply strangles with one hand. So if you're really good at trapping arms from back, if you're good at playing the crucifix position, I would highly recommend you develop a very, very strong garrote style one-handed strangle. Because again, even if we don't get the submission, we panic them and cause them to make forced errors. They start reacting, overreacting, and then we can consolidate the finish. All right, guys, let's talk about how to beat good hand fighters when we have their back. So this is something I developed while I was actually rolling with Nicky Rod, because for a guy that's absolutely enormous, he has an incredible ability to reach back and grab hands. So I had to come up with an idea of how we could distract those hands and cinch in these strangles, right? So let me give you an example, yeah. So Nicky Rod's ability to find these hands, even with good positioning, and start stripping them is a nightmare. And we're going from side to side, and he just keeps stripping the hands. Sometimes even we'll have things almost perfect, and Nicky Rod will still find a way to pull these arms out. Which again, is incredible in its own right, because you'd assume someone that big wouldn't even be able to reach behind himself, right? So we had to come up with a dilemma. And again, generally speaking, when I attack Nicky Rod, he's got good, he's protecting his neck. He's got good chin hiding ability there, right? So what I would do to someone like Nicky Rod is I basically, instead of reaching for the shoulder, I reach all the way behind the neck here. Again, because I'm trying to prevent his ability to reach that hand. But it's more of a diversion, right? So he's tucking his chin. I come over the top. Instead of trying to finish my hands here, I'm going to use this elbow to lift and throw the other hand underneath. Now we've created a dilemma, right? So basically the secondary hand that's come around and in front of his throat is hidden by my other armpit. So Placido's only choice is to choose the hand he can find. If he reaches for my left hand, he won't find it. Very hard. So he has to strip the right grip. And as he does that, we get a clean attempt at the other side. So again, if a guy's got incredible ability to hand fight from here, especially I'm going to emphasize late stage hand fight. So if you find yourself losing rear naked strangles from here, because guys are incredibly flexible and strong, we can throw some sort of a dilemma at them. They have to pick a hand. They can't defend both at the same time. So we lift and we place this under. Sometimes even here we can achieve a strangle in and of its own right, but it would be more of a garrote strangle because we have a hand on the arm behind their shoulder and we're pulling our elbow back. So it's more of a garrote strangle while distracting them with two hands in the game. So again, they're expecting this, but instead of going over, we're going under. So we can threaten a garrote strangle, create some urgency in their hand fight, and if they do start to strip that hand, switch heads to the other side, and we've got the strangle on this side. So a great way to basically set up rear naked strangles against guys that have incredible hand fighting is trying to strangle basically both arms at once. Obviously, we're not going to throw them both in at the same time, but I'm going to use one to expose the neck to start setting up a garrote. And we can finish here, or if they hand fight, we can come across. If they by miracle get this bottom hand, we can throw it back and we can keep cycling through these options until we find a clean strangle. But again, while you're keeping their hands busy, they're not escaping. So we're still having good back control maintenance, right? Very hard to hand fight strangles and clear hooks at the same time. What your opponent's going to do is he's going to prevent the strangle, secure those strangle hands by winning the hand fight entirely, and then starting to clear hooks. So again, don't feel too concerned that both hands are occupying a strangle threat because it's something they have to address before they can escape. If they were to forget about the strangle hands, try to escape the lower body, they're 100% going to get strangled every time. And again, we're combining variations. We're over the face, we're using the garrote, we could come back to either side to complete any of the strangles covered previously in this chapter. All right, guys, let's take a look at a very, very simple grip break from the back. The most, probably most high percentage one I find, and probably one of the easiest ones to pick up, especially for beginners, but it still works at the high level. So just for visuals, Placido's on his knees, but we have our seatbelt, right? You can see Placido taking a thumb inside grip, and typically a lot of guys will bring their elbow high as well. So it's very hard for me to strangle him. Obviously, we didn't have his hand and he wasn't hand fighting, we'd come straight into the strangle. But he gets that thumb inside. So the way we're gonna break this grip, we're gonna bring our second hand and look at our palm. Then we're gonna connect palm to palm. And you see, even with the long reach I have, I can't even necessarily just go palm to palm. I'll generally speaking connect fingers and I'll finger walk. And now when Placido tries to keep this grip, I raise my elbow and I separate my hands. And it's an easy way to secure the second hand and throw in a strangle hand. So again, we've got our seatbelt. We want to look at the palm of our hand. We want to finger walk and get as close to palm as possible. I don't just karate chop down. I lift my elbow to load up his wrist. And now when I slice down, we strip the grip and get the strangle. So really why we want to lift the elbow is his thumb's here and we want to apply pressure to it. So when we strip that grip, it's going to apply pressure to his wrist and strip it out, right? So we're stripping that wire. It's going to put pressure on their wrist. But again, it's not a pressure that they can't release. We're applying pressure to their wrist that if they release it, they're just simply giving us a strangle and wrist control. But high percentage, super, super simple way to break the grip from the seatbelt position. All right, now we're going to talk about a counter to the 2-on-1. 2-on-1, very, very common counter in jiu-jitsu. I would say even more common in MMA because obviously they got the end of the lever, they get the glove, they're trapped. So if you watch a lot of MMA, you'll see they pass the arm over their head to do their escapes and maintain top position. So let's have a look at what that entails, right? So very common escape from here would be to Placido to pass that arm over his head. And it's starting to limit my options here. And again, MMA fighters, generally speaking, like to use escapes where they end up on top. In MMA, in Jiu-Jitsu, guys are quite happy to escape back and concede mount. But again, you don't really have that luxury in MMA. And you can see based on the 2-on-1 grip, if I had a glove on, it's going to be much, much easier for him to hold on versus me right now, which is gloveless, right? But we're going to do an early stage counter. So the grip that's really the problem for us here is Placido's left hand. If he held my hand with his right, I would still be able to climb this up and get a strangle. If this wasn't in the equation and he simply had this grip, that's going to be enough to prevent me strangling him, right? So when he takes a 2-on-1, he takes two hands on that wrist because it's going to be easier for him to pass it over his head. But if we want to strangle him out of this grip, this is the only one we need to deal with, right? So the second I feel someone take a 2-on-1, as they start lifting, I let go of my hands and I slap this wrist as I punch my arm straight. And then we can start feeding this hand behind the neck and start setting up strangles, right? It works because it's a counter pressure we're applying here. I can't hold his wrist and strip it. I can't just punch it free. I need to eliminate this hand by slapping it and punching it away from Placido, away from the direction he's pulling it, right? So if I ever feel he's got a 2-on-1, as soon as the hand starts stripping, I'll punch that hand free and start applying strangle pressure. And then of course here we can start sitting them up and setting up that strangle. But a very simple early counter. Great one for people that really love this 2-on-1. So if you train with a lot of MMA fighters, those guys, this is going to be their bread and butter style escape from the back. So a clever little counter to this would be to slap that wrist. So as soon as you start feel like we're resisting, we punch and bring it around the neck. And then we have great opportunities to start strangling here because the 2-on-1 grip can be very, very irritating, especially big, strong guys that just hang on to that wrist, whether they're hanging on to attempt an escape later or just hanging on to survive. Because again, a lot of people in a training environment, rather than taking the necessary risks they should to improve their game, they'd rather just not get submitted. So here's a little counter to a 2-on-1 from the back. All right, so let's look at a late stage 2-on-1 counter. And funnily enough, if we rewind to that match where I armbarred Gordon Ryan, this is actually the sequence that took place. Obviously, I didn't armbar him, but I do count that as a victory because most people would have submitted at that point, right? And he's got to give me one of these one day. So we'll go to the 2-on-1 counter. I got Placido's back. So obviously in the last one, we had the early stage counter where Placido starts opening my hands and I slap and pull it through. But in this stage, maybe I'm not quick enough. Maybe Placido's very quick and he brings the arm over the head. But what's funny about this grip is he's basically setting up the Kimura style armbar from the back. But merely by the fact that he's holding my own wrist, he's given me basically the same option here. So if you guys visualize this again, when he holds onto my wrist tight for the escape, what's actually happening is he's giving me the same sort of control. So I can easily just throw my leg over the head. So I want you to imagine there's no way that I would be able to do that armbar without some sort of grip on the wrist. But the fact that Placido is using my wrist and holding it so tightly, he's giving me that control without me actually taking anything. Sort of a little bit of a trick here, right? So if I didn't have any grip on Placido here and I threw a leg over, chances are I'm not going to get that arm. If I have a Kimura here and I throw the leg over, I've got the arm. If Placido is so concerned with escape that he's got an iron-like grip on this wrist for a 2-on-1 escape, those second handers. He's got the second hand as well, so he's got an iron-tight grip on this wrist because he's thinking about escape. he's giving me the same control over this arm, just not intentionally. And it allows me to throw my leg over the head to start attacking the arm. And of course, the way he's gripping here is not going to be conducive to preventing me extending his arm. And I can start to slide my elbow down and look for that wrist. So we're going to just do a basic summary of how we'd finish the armbar here. We'll ignore the fact that I had Gordon here and didn't break his arm. And we'll just assume this is what I should have done from this position. Sadly, I did not know these things at that stage of my career, right? So the best principle for finishing armbars is the left, 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 right, right, right principle. So if I'm attacking Placido's left arm, I want his elbow over my left hip and I want his hand over my left shoulder. That's going to create a very strong fulcrum at which we can start to apply pressure into the elbow here. If I was attacking his left arm and I placed his left elbow and left wrist over my right hip and right elbow, I'm encouraging this hitchhiker style escape, and actually the braking pressure is going to be much weaker. As I apply it, I'm turning Placido out, versus if we place it over the left hip and left shoulder, we can start to get the submission here, right? So just the real trick to this thought process, right, is I want you to remember that if he grabs the 2-on-1 too tightly, he's controlling your wrist, but he's giving you, unintentionally, control over his entire arm. The tighter he grabs you, the more certain you know where that arm is without actually grabbing it yourself. So we're playing off here. Placido gets that 2-on-1, brings it over the head. All we're looking to do is throw that secondary leg in front of his face here. So my hamstring is hitting his face and my left elbow slides up, and that's going to break that 2-on-1 grip of his. And I immediately grab the thumb and wrist section here. I bring my feet close together, and we know the left, left, left principle because I'm attacking his left arm. So left elbow over left hip, left wrist over left shoulder. We start to apply bridging pressure here, and we get the submission. So we'll keep it pretty simple on braking mechanics for the armbar here. I just really want you to focus on, when you're practicing this armbar, remembering to get the left, 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 right, right, right principle. And this is basically the same setup I used on Gordon, minus the tap at the later stage of that technique. But Gordon went for a 2-on-1 escape because he was so concerned with controlling my wrist. He was unintentionally giving me control over his entire arm.
Good job finishing that.
All right, so we're going to talk about a type of control from the back that is straitjacket control. I'm going to provide some depth to this, but remember, this instruction was focusing on front head submissions, how to get the front head, path to the back, go behind, how to take hooks from turtle, and also mat returns, right? So we're briefly touching on concepts from the back to give you good control, but we're going to have much, much more in-depth instructionals on the back itself. Because again, even straitjacket, we could probably go 2 hours on straitjacket control. But just to give you an understanding of what the straitjacket is, it's a form of wrist-to-wrist control that basically allows us to trap an arm. But again, you guys can see it's like a straitjacket. That's where the visuals come from, right? So this position is very, very effective because what we're doing is we're taking a straitjacket control so that we can trap one of our opponent's arms. And now we have a base of attack where we've got 2 free hands versus their 1 free hands. And I will also add, the straitjacket can work on people of all body types. But again, the longer you are, the easier it's going to be to consolidate the arm you trap. And again, the more flexible your hips are, the easier it's going to be to trap that hand. But it doesn't mean that you can't do it if you're shorter. It just means your technique needs to be better from this position, right? So let's look at the straitjacket here. So typically from the seatbelt, because Placido is going to be defending strangles here, his wrists aren't going to be far away. So here's a concept with basically tunnel vision. If you're sitting on a guy's back and all you want to get is wrist-to-wrist control and their wrists are apart and not giving them to you, just strangle them.
You know what I mean? Like, you want to work straight jackets, but if they're giving you something else, take it, right? The easiest way to get their wrist back into play is to start threatening a strangle. What's Placido going to do? He's going to hand fight. And that's where we can start connecting these wrists here. If we get one wrist and he knows we want this wrist and his hand's away from us, what's the shortest way to get that back? Start threatening a strangle, and he brings the hand back in and we go to our straight jacket control. So what we want key here is the arm we're going to trap is always going to be the top arm. So we're going to go left hand to right wrist, right hand to left wrist. But we need our left hand underneath the other one, because if we try to grab grips here, he's going to be easier for him to escape. It's going to be harder for me to trap that arm, because you can see I need my left arm at extension, and it's not going to be able to do that while his other arm is on top. So we always want the underhook arm to be underneath the other arm. And that's how when we extend our arm straight, it gets this full range of motion. And we need this full range of motion because it's the only way I can bring this wrist close to my foot here. So again, the arm that we're going to trap, the wrist that's grabbing that arm needs to be below the other arm. And when we grab this other wrist, we don't just have to grab the wrist. Sometimes with the modern turning style escapes, when we just go wrist to wrist, it's still quite hard to control Placido's upper body here. So another great way to get control over this arm is I threaten a strangle, Placido brings his arm back into exchange, and we grab the elbow itself. So I've grabbed Placido's elbow, and I'm also covering his wrist. So now if he tries to make sharp shoulder movements, it's going to be very difficult. We basically have seatbelt style pressure, but with straight jacket style control. Because again, if you see me grabbing the wrist here, Placido's shoulders can still move quite a bit, versus we control his elbow here. Something we need to be careful of, right? Obviously, we're extending this arm and we're going to throw a heel in to trap this arm. An easy way for Placido to annoy us and not allow us to have it is to lift his right elbow to the sky. And now, obviously, you'd need to be super flexible if you could even reach that leg at all. So a little trick we can do from here is we can touch our knee to his elbow. Now Placido tries to lift his elbow, basically impossible. His arm is not going to overpower my leg, or at least I hope not. So when we get our wrist to wrist, straight jacket standard style, or we control this elbow here and trap the wrist inside, if you have a very savvy opponent, make sure you touch your knee to their elbow. Once we touch the knee to the elbow, you're going to find it's very easy to trap this arm. Now let's talk about how we trap this arm and ways to keep it. A very traditional way that people would trap arms is they just trap it with one leg, and they place their leg behind the other guy's back. So if we reverse this, you can see the style of control. Many a grappler have historically trapped an arm and put their foot in the center of the back. There's nothing wrong with this except the control won't be as good. And it won't be as good because if I lose Placido's left arm, he can grab my left foot and hop over these legs. And now we have a crucifix. But again, a crucifix is a strong position, but it's not going to be as strong as a back control, especially back control with an arm trap. So I'm not going to say there's something wrong with it. Sometimes it can be easier for people with shorter legs to trap an arm that way. But I will say it is an inferior control to what I'm about to show you. So we've trapped an arm. What I want you to do is just slide, if you straighten this leg, slide your foot down to their hip and throw the other one over the top. Now Placido tries to strip these grips, tries to move. Absolutely no chance at all. Even if I lost this wrist, he's not going to be able to open this closed wedge here, right? Versus foot behind the back, you'll see him be able to reach with his foot, potentially hop over it. So the best way to control Placido's arm from here, it's going to be that the hand that's trapped, the foot that traps the hand, slides to the hip and throws the other one on bottom. We definitely want this foot configuration. We want the foot that captured their arm to go on bottom. If it goes on top, you'll see Placido has a little bit more space to potentially slip that arm back in. So what we want to make sure is when we trap this arm, the other foot goes on top here. And now that arm is really, really trapped. Obviously, we want to keep our feet at the hip here. I don't want to throw both feet past the hip. You'll see Placido can raise his shoulder and start to find space to slip that arm out. So if Placido extends this leg straight, I want you to place your foot on their hip bone and the other one on top. Now when Placido tries to move through that arm, much, much more difficult than if we threw both feet outside. So you can definitely have a play with all these things while you're drilling it with your training partners, right? So we want to find the ultimate way to trap that arm. And that's going to be it. I haven't found a superior way to trap an arm from someone's back. A little mistake I need to mention for beginners is obviously don't throw crossed feet in between their groin. Placido can apply a footlock at this position, and it's going to be a very embarrassing way to get submitted out of such a strong position. So just keep your feet on the hip here. Now in terms of strangling, we can strangle them from the underhook side, just as we covered previous. And this is the example I would most often see an underhook side strangle, because again, now we've got two hands against Placido's one. So we can start threatening the strangle. And if I can't free this arm, just sit him up. And we can sit him up in the exact same way with the arm trapped within our legs. If you're really not confident finishing the strangle on the underhook side, we can start to pull them on top of us here and fall to the outside here. And we can make a foot exchange to get the body triangle on the top side. And this would be dead to right. If you get someone here and they survive and escape, I would say you've made many, many errors in your positioning. We've got the top side body triangle, the strongest form of body triangle. Placido's arms trapped on bottom, and it's trapped underneath his weight and inside my body triangle. There's not a chance in hell Placido's going to free this arm here. We can even control his wrist. And because we're on the strangle side, it's super easy to free that secondary hand and throw him in the strangle. So this form of control is the ultimate form of control. So let's have a look at it a couple more times. So we're on our underhook side here. We've got our body triangle. We need to get these wrists. Again, if he's being stupid and leaving his hands out, just strangle him. Again, you can't force your training partners to give the right responses. You can only make them give the right responses by punishing them for giving the wrong responses. So again, Placido's hands will be close. And then we can start having a hand fight here. So we've got these wrist control. We want to go left to left, right to right. Right to right, or if we threaten the strangle and he brings the elbow close, a superior form of control by grabbing the elbow. We do not want to trap the hand behind the back, because if he frees this arm, he has this chance of escape. So we want to trap our feet in front of the hips with the arm trapping leg on bottom. Now Placido tries to free his hands. Very, very difficult. Again, we can threaten a strangle from here, but we want to ultimately sit him up to free that hand to get good elbow position. But if that's not happening, we can start to pull them on top of us here. And you'll find naturally some guys do go for this movement, right? Because Placido's options are very, very limited here. He cannot free this arm, and he knows we're going for the strangle. A lot of times guys will bridge up on top of you here, allowing you to fall to the other hip. When you fall to the other hip, you can do a hand assist here. So instead of my left hand controlling his left wrist, I'll switch it to my right. I'll grab my right shin and open my legs. So that way when I fall to the other side, we can throw in the body triangle easier.
Give it a rotate.
So again, we've got this hand assist that'll help you body triangle people that you ordinarily wouldn't be able to body triangle. And then we land in this perfect side to start threatening strangles. And again, if you get someone here, it should be dead to rights. And that right there is a basic introduction to the straight jacket control from the back. Again, straight jacket control, because it looks like you're wearing a straight jacket. Left to left, right to right, elbow control. We're going to trap the arm in front of the hip, not behind the back, which allows them to force a crucifix to escape. We can finish
on the underhook side, or if they bridge on top of us, we can finish on the overhook side. So really we're backing them into a corner. He's basically going to get finished if he stays on the underhook side. So he has to make a movement, which could be a big bridge, one of the few movements he could make. But if he does that, we back him further and further into a corner where the submission finish is basically guaranteed. All right, guys, we're going to briefly cover the Yoshiro Senkaku, or the back triangle. So we're going to briefly cover it because I've covered this extensively in my most recent DVD, which was Systematic Submission Dilemmas, where we cover a lot of breaking mechanics and finishing mechanics, especially on this particular submission, right? So obviously we could force the Yoshiro Senkaku out of the back, but again, like in my opinion, we got the back, we're going to go for rear naked strangles because we've got the strongest position, and that, in my opinion, is the strongest submission. To go for the Yoshiro Senkaku from here and force it would be to give your opponent an opportunity to escape, no matter how good you are, right? I target the Yoshiro Senkaku from the back when I mess up the arm trap from the straitjacket control, right? So when we have our straitjacket control, we're trying to trap this arm, and I'm trying to trap it below the shoulder line. If I'm below Placido's shoulder, his arm is completely isolated, right? But sometimes very sneaky defensive opponents will, as you go for the trap, they'll slide their shoulder down. So you see now I've ended up with the arm trapped below the shoulder. And of course, if I trapped his arm here, he's too far away for me to attack any sort of rear naked. But he's not so far away that we can't hit a back triangle, right? So if you guys see this, don't panic. We've still got a great chance to submit them here. But what you're going to do, you're going to trap that arm and cross your feet here. We're going to come under this elbow. And we're going to go wrist to wrist. And what we can do here to get him moving, because this is a very weak angle. Again, we're putting potentially athletic people in unathletic positions. We can start to bridge and try to pull his wrist to our chest. But in terms of in relation to his head, we're trying to pull his wrist and elbow behind his head here. We're going to open our legs and we're going to switch to our right hip. And as I do that, my right foot tucks really tight towards my other knee. And I don't leave this leg out because he's going to trap it in half guard here. The trick is, as we switch hips, both our feet come back. And it gives us the ability to cross our legs outside of his legs here. So don't switch hips and cross over here. Placido, we're basically giving him his only path to escape here. And you're not going to finish the Yoshiro Senkaku from basically a half guard position. We have to get this foot behind. So when we make this transition, we're going to be doing basically a hip switch here. So we're going to trap the arm, but he shrugged it. Cross your feet momentarily, if you throw this way, just so you can grab your hand under his elbow and the hand that was the strangle hand under the wrist. Again, we take a potentially athletic movement and we put him into an unathletic position. Placido is going to be strong while his elbow and wrist are in front of his head. But when we pull it behind, he tries to explode. It's going to be insane pressure on his shoulder. So now we extend, we get that arm behind the head, we open our legs, I switch hips, and I pull both legs back. And we get this ability to cross our feet before he can catch our leg in his half guard here, which again is going to kill this submission. We want to cross that secondary foot in front of the hip here, just for extra leverage and to sort of make it difficult so that he can't reach my leg and pull it back inside, underneath or over the top. If this foot's floating here loose, he brings it back in. If we reinforce it under the hip, his ability to scoop it greatly limited. To get the finish, I'm just applying back heeling pressure and I'm extending this foot. So I'm not like a ballerina, I'm curling it back. So I'm putting the boot in here and we get a submission. But again, we've got many, many options here. We could potentially attack this wrist. We could attack a Kimura, and the Kimura is going to be very tight because he has no shoulder mobility. We could attack an armbar. Place it again, the left arm over left hip and left shoulder. If that's not strong enough,
we could reinforce the submission with an overhook. We grab the elbow, we pull our elbow tight, and we start to hip in. If Placido turns his thumb down to the floor, the other direction, we can apply Americana pressure while cupping the elbow and pulling it forward. So we've got many, many options from here. But again, the strongest option will be, so long as the arm's behind the head, just applying like you're putting the boot on pressure, like you're retracting your toes towards your knee, and it should be a tight, gentle squeeze. So one more time from this angle here. Sorry, Placido.
He's not something.
So we trap the arm, but Placido sneaks his shoulder in. We're going to cross our feet, and we're going to come under the elbow and under the wrist. To overpower stronger guys here, I don't just think I'm pulling his arm behind his head with my wrist. I apply some hip pressure, and you can see how Placido tries to resist it. If I just use my arms, even Placido at his strength level, it's going to make that difficult, right? If we apply hip pressure, we can pull the arm behind the head. We open our legs to switch hips, and we prevent them cupping our leg into a half guard position. And we can cross our feet safely from the outside and apply the submission pressure to get the strangle. So again, we briefly touched on it here.
I've gone into it in much more detail on systematic submission dilemmas. But again, I have to remind you, once we get to the back, we go for the straitjacket. We have a lot of options from that position. All right, guys. So let's talk about maintaining the back. So obviously, I explained diagonal control, and that is a key principle in maintaining the back. But what I want to explain to you today is when this scene is the difference between controlling the back from the underhook and the overhook. So basically, or the strangle side, a lot of people typically thought that you would always control the back from the strangle side. And I would say that's probably a bit of outdated knowledge. And I think what changed that was EBI. EBI rules, obviously, priority number one is going to be to finish them in the overtime period because we start on each other's back or on the arm. But a lot of guys just think, I'm not going to try to finish the guy, I'm just going to try to hold him for as long as possible so they win via ride time. And based on how EBI's played out, the best way to control someone is from the underhook side. Because to me, the most common escape from back position is going to be Placido getting an inside shoulder to the floor. So if we're on the strangle side, Placido gets the shoulder to the floor. He's basically halfway out here. Very hard for me to recover. Not impossible, but once the shoulder's on the floor, I'm in a lot of danger. And typically what people would worry about, why people wouldn't recommend that escape, was because people used to say that if he started escaping that side, we'd be able to turn this into an arm triangle choke. But basically, Placido knows that is an option for me from there, and just basically we eliminate the element of surprise. He's prepared for that. He's practiced this escape, and he's been countered with the arm triangle. He knows it's coming, he can see it coming, and it's easy for him to fight. So this basically trying to control people on the strangle side is very, very weak. Because again, it's although we do have diagonal control, it is difficult for me to prevent this shoulder coming to the mat. Very, very difficult, right? So again, Placido gets the shoulder to the mat. It's tough for me to maintain the position. But if we switch and we're on the underhook side, it's impossible for Placido to get the inside shoulder to the floor because I'm under this arm here. Even if we took this out of the equation, Placido tries to get his inside shoulder to the floor, he cannot. So diagonal control means much more when we have the underhook side on bottom. So typically, again, old school knowledge, they wouldn't want to be on this side. A lot of old school guys would think, oh, this is the way we escape from the underhook side. But again, your chances of escape, especially against the modern day grapplers, ultra technical from this position, much slimmer from here. Another thing guys would think, especially old school guys, is that if you control someone on the underhook side, even if they get the strangle in, now they have to get this hand out. But of course, we've addressed that in this product. We can sit them up and we can get the arm in quite easy, right? So what I want you to visualize when you're maintaining back control is that if we think in control above everything else, we want the underhook side, right? So a lot of people these days will force you onto the strangle side because they know they have a greater chance of escape. So let's say Placido has forced me onto this hip. And again, he's forced me strangle side and underhook side. He's forced me onto the strangle side. And he starts trying to get his inside shoulder to the floor. What we want to do from here is cup this shoulder here. So you see, I'm holding Placido's shoulder off the ground just a little bit. I'm not going to hold it here forever, especially if he's slippery. Eventually he's going to slip and get his shoulder to the floor. But we can use this grip to turn the strangle side into the underhook side. So as Placido begins his escape, I grab the shoulder, I pick it up just to get this hand underneath this side, right? So as he starts bringing it to the floor, I pick it up, place the hand underneath, and I pull my head back underneath his head. And now we've turned the strangle side into the underhook side. And now we're back to having excellent control. Back to the best control position from the back, apart from, obviously, if we could trap it up. So again, I want you guys to really practice this one. This one's going to save you a lot. If he does get his shoulder to the floor, we're obviously not going to pick it up back off the floor. But if we catch it on the way down, I sense him going, I cup it just for a sec to pull it up and place my hand underneath his armpit. My hand here is enough. I can let go of this arm now, and I can turn this into an underhook. As Placido continues his escape, it's super easy to pick him back up, place our head back underneath, and return to this side. Right. So one of the best escapes Placido has from here is to force me onto the strangle side, start working to get his shoulder to the floor, obviously looking to block the arm triangle. But again, these days, not a lot of people set up the arm triangle from there. They try to maintain the back because really, you're in a great position. Why give that up in pursuit of a submission? When people start to get the inside shoulder to the floor, we want to cup that shoulder, lift it, get our arm underneath, and turn the strangle side into the underhook side. Guys, another common escape from the back, and it's something that's very tricky to deal with, especially in sweaty environments, right? So, and again, this one's very common as a result of EBI. I think EBI has done a lot to develop people's back control and back escapes, and has really shown the flaws in certain people's back controls, and again, the flaws in people's escapes. But one escape that's very, very difficult to manage is the turning escape, right? So if I have Placido, I'm sitting here with a seatbelt. Again, remember this in the context of a sweaty environment. If I'm just holding a seatbelt and Placido just aggressively starts turning away, opening up my arms, it's hard for me to maintain control over Placido, and he can start to slip. Sometimes guys will even strip your grips and start to roll, right? So sometimes I'll be here, Placido separates the hands, and I'm trying to follow Placido, but his movements are going to be smaller than mine to maintain the back control. So it's very difficult to prevent the turning escape while keeping a seatbelt control, right? So a lot of guys have the assumption that the guy in their back is only going to hold a seatbelt, so they know they can really go for a turning escape. But the key to preventing a turning escape is the wrist ride. So if I have Placido here, and I know he's good at turning escapes, if I can control his wrist and I can apply elbow pressure out to his arm here as he starts to turn out from me, he finds it very difficult here. Very, very difficult. If I have a seatbelt, watch how he uses his arms to load up. He pulls his elbow underneath him to gain height. So we see that one more time. I'm trying to hold Placido here, but he can build height and start to turn. If I control his wrist, and I control it in a weak way, he can still pull his elbow underneath and come up. If I keep his elbow out, now he tries to turn. Basically impossible, right? But again, some guys are going to be very strong, but the mere fact is, if they turn and you have this wrist, he's not going to turn as quick. So he really goes for it. So I'll let him get up for this one. As long as I have this elbow control, it's very difficult for Placido to achieve that turning escape. And even from the strangle side as well, we're controlling this wrist. It's going to be hard for Placido to turn away from it.
Yeah.
If I have a seatbelt, he can start to build base and turn away. So you have to remember to use the wrist right. So say, for example, I have a seatbelt and Placido starts to turn. What I want to do, he really gets up, is control that wrist as soon as possible. And he can quite often end up belly down here. And even if he rolls through, we maintain this wrist control here to stick to his back. It allows us to stay behind him, right? So even think about it, Placido is on a hip here. The wrist is preventing Placido turning too far or turning into me here. It's the same thing. If I had a seatbelt, he could still turn up to turtle quite easily. If I have the wrist and he's collapsed to the shoulder, tries to turn to turtle, very, very hard, right? It at least slows him down. So if you're having trouble with people's turning escapes, generally no time limit, submission only, guys. I want you to remember to use the wrist right. Control the elbow, and you're going to stay behind them.